She's my teacher, and the one who shouldn't feel this way about me. Yet every glance, every brush of her hand, makes the line between right and wrong blur. The first day of the creative writing seminar felt ordinary enough, the kind of Thursday that drifts by unnoticed until something subtle shifts your focus. I was early, like always, fumbling with my notebook as I tried to settle into a corner seat where I could observe without being intrusive. And then she walked in. She carried herself with that effortless confidence that only comes from years of knowing exactly who you are, yet there was a quiet softness to her presence. I noticed the way her heels clicked against the hardwood floor, precise but unhurried, and the small smile she offered each student as she greeted us. It wasn't overly warm or rehearsed, it was measured, genuine, and it made the room feel lighter, as if she was quietly approving of our existence without saying a word. When she began to speak, her voice had a calm authority, smooth and measured, with just the faintest crack of amusement when a student made an awkward comment. I found myself listening harder, not just to her words but to the way she spoke them, the slight rise and fall of her tone, the rhythm of her gestures, the gentle sweep of her hand across the desk as she leaned in to explain a point. Everything about her felt deliberate, yet somehow inviting. And then it happened. A small, seemingly insignificant moment, but one I would remember with an odd mix of nervous excitement for weeks. I had left my essay draft slightly askew, and she stepped beside me to adjust it. Our fingers brushed lightly, a fleeting touch that sent a ripple of warmth through me, almost electric in its subtlety. She didn't linger, but I did. I noticed the faint scent of her perfume, a soft, floral note that mingled oddly well with the old paper and ink in the room. My heart betrayed me by skipping a beat, and I cursed myself silently for feeling something I knew I shouldn't. It wasn't just physical. There was something about the way she looked at me, brief but perceptive, that hinted she noticed more than just the words I wrote. It was as if she could see the small hesitation behind my otherwise calm demeanor, and I realized that for the first time, I wanted to be noticed, not for my grades, not for my work, but for the parts of me I usually kept tucked away. As the class continued, I found myself stealing glances at her, trying to catch those subtle expressions, the slight furrow of her brow when she concentrated, the soft laughter that escaped when a student said something unintentionally funny. I felt a strange mix of awe and vulnerability, aware of the age gap between us yet drawn to the quiet gravity of her presence. By the time the seminar ended, I was acutely aware of one truth: something had shifted, however imperceptibly. The ordinary Thursday had transformed into a day marked by a brief touch, a glance that lingered a fraction too long, and the first stirrings of a fascination that I wasn't sure I was allowed to have. And in that fleeting, charged moment, I realized that I was already dangerously curious about her, and about the quiet pull she had over me. It didn't take long for the initial spark of curiosity to deepen into something more complicated. Over the next few classes, our interactions remained polite and professional, yet I couldn't ignore the subtle threads that seemed to connect us. The way she glanced at me from across the room during group exercises, the quiet acknowledgement when I offered a particularly insightful comment, made me painfully aware of every heartbeat in my chest. One afternoon, we were paired for a writing exercise. The room was warm, sunlight spilling across the hardwood floors, dust motes dancing lazily in the shafts of light. Sitting across from her, I felt a strange mixture of nervousness and anticipation. Her presence was commanding yet comforting, like standing near a fireplace that radiates warmth without overwhelming you. As we discussed plot structures, I noticed the delicate way she would tuck a strand of hair behind her ear or lean in slightly to peer at my notes. Those movements were unremarkable on their own, but in her company, they felt intentional, intimate, almost teasing. She offered a quiet smile as she traced her finger along a line of my writing, a gesture that seemed casual, yet the warmth of her touch lingered far longer than it should have. It wasn't electric or overwhelming, but subtle, like a candle flickering in a quiet room, drawing attention without demanding it. I caught myself wanting more, wanting just a few extra seconds in the closeness of her presence, though I reminded myself that the line between admiration and desire was delicate, easily blurred. After class, as students shuffled out into the hallway, she hesitated by the door, glancing back at me. Her eyes held a softness, an unspoken recognition that felt almost like a secret. "I really appreciate your perspective on that scene," she said, her voice low and steady. "It's refreshing." She handed me a sheet of paper with notes, our fingers brushing once more. That brief contact was enough to make my pulse race, though outwardly I remained composed. The hallway was empty except for us, the faint hum of the heater filling the quiet space, and I realized I was noticing her more than I should. I began to observe her in small, quiet ways, how she paused mid-step as if considering her words carefully, the subtle crease at the corner of her eyes when she laughed softly, the faint perfume that seemed to linger in the air just after she passed. Each of these details, small and fleeting, etched themselves into my mind. For her part, she seemed slightly more relaxed around me than with other students, offering a nod here, a gentle comment there, with an attention that felt both professional and strangely personal. I couldn't be certain if it was intentional or if I was simply imagining it, but each moment added to a growing awareness. We were connected in ways that were quiet but undeniable. By the end of the day, as I packed my bag and felt the lingering warmth of her gaze, I realized that something had shifted. Our connection wasn't bold or overt, it was small, subtle, and electric in its restraint. It was the beginning of an intimacy measured in glances, in fleeting touches, in shared understanding that neither of us dared to fully name aloud. And somehow, that unspoken bond felt heavier and more significant than anything else I had experienced in a long time. By the third week of the seminar, what began as fleeting admiration had deepened into a subtle, almost tangible connection. I found myself noticing her in ways that made the ordinary seem charged with quiet electricity. It wasn't just her elegance or poise, it was the small, almost imperceptible details that lingered in my mind long after class ended. The way she adjusted her scarf while reviewing student work, the faint crease of concentration on her forehead, even the way she hummed softly when no one else was paying attention. These moments, brief as they were, began to feel like shared secrets, a language unspoken yet understood. One afternoon, she lingered longer than usual over my assignment. As she read, her finger traced the lines, not hurriedly but with deliberation, and our eyes met occasionally, her gaze calm yet attentive. There was a pause, a small hesitation in her movements, that made me acutely aware of the space between us. It wasn't inappropriate, far from it, but it was charged, as if each glance and subtle gesture carried weight beyond words. I felt my pulse quicken, a mix of admiration and something more tender, restrained, and deeply unsettling. I started to observe her habits with a new intensity. She had a way of pressing her lips together when she was thinking, a soft exhale that almost sounded like a sigh. I noticed how she'd occasionally glance out the window, as if lost in a private thought, and I wondered, not for the first time, if she ever thought of me in those moments. The curiosity was mutual, I could sense it in the way she sometimes lingered at my desk, offering feedback just a touch more personal than for others. Her hand would hover near mine when pointing out corrections, brushing against mine lightly, deliberately, or perhaps by accident. Either way, the effect was the same, a jolt of warmth and something more complicated, something I couldn't name without risking propriety. There was a growing tension in our interactions, unspoken yet unmistakable. We didn't flirt outright, our conversations remained polite, thoughtful, and professional. But there was a subtle intimacy in how we shared ideas, a softness in her tone when she praised my observations, and a faint, fleeting smile that seemed reserved just for me. Each small gesture created a quiet undercurrent of desire, something neither of us could fully acknowledge but both clearly felt. Even mundane moments became charged. The sound of her notebook brushing against mine as she passed it back, the soft rustle of her clothing as she leaned over a desk, the faint perfume that clung to the air around her, all of it seemed amplified in my perception. I found myself craving these small, innocent exchanges, feeling both elation and guilt at the attention I received. By the end of the class, I realized the unspoken truth: we were curious about each other, and the curiosity was mutual. It was a connection that existed in glances, in small touches, in moments that would seem inconsequential to anyone else but felt monumental to us. The tension simmered beneath the surface, subtle yet undeniable, and I knew that this slow-burn fascination was only beginning. It was one of those rainy afternoons when the classroom felt suspended in time. The steady drumming of raindrops against the windows created a muted rhythm, a quiet backdrop that made the world outside feel distant and unimportant. Most of the students had left early, leaving only a few scattered papers on desks, the faint smell of damp coats mingling with the lingering aroma of chalk and coffee. Somehow, it felt like the perfect setting for something unspoken yet inevitable to emerge. I had stayed behind to ask her a question about narrative perspective, though my real reason was harder to articulate. There was a pull toward her, an almost gravitational force that made my usual reserve crumble in her presence. She noticed immediately and gave a small, knowing smile, her eyes soft but attentive, inviting me into a space that felt both private and fragile. "I sometimes wonder if I push my students too hard," she confessed quietly, her voice barely above the rain's rhythm. "Some of them, they make me feel things I shouldn't. And I can't let it affect my judgment." Her words were casual, but the tremor in her tone betrayed an unexpected vulnerability. I realized then that beneath her composed, confident exterior, she was human, capable of doubt, of hesitation, of feelings she couldn't entirely control. I hesitated, then decided to be honest, as I had never been in a classroom before. "I think. I understand. Sometimes, I feel things too. When someone notices the small parts of me, the things I try to hide, it matters more than I expected." My voice was low, careful, yet there was a rawness to it, the kind that comes from sharing something deeply personal with someone who might never understand fully, but in this moment, I trusted her. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was heavy, but not uncomfortable. It was a shared pause, a recognition that something significant was unfolding between us. And then, almost imperceptibly, she reached out, her hand resting lightly on my shoulder. The warmth of her touch was grounding, and yet it carried an intensity one could not ignore. I felt her steady heartbeat through the thin fabric of her sleeve, a quiet reassurance that she was present, that she understood. We spoke little after that, letting the words and the moment carry their weight. Our conversation shifted back to the assignment, but the air between us had changed. There was a new intimacy, one that didn't require declarations or overt gestures. Just the awareness of each other's presence, the quiet acknowledgement of feelings that neither of us fully named, and the subtle power of trust that had begun to build between us. As I left the classroom that day, the rain soaking my coat and the dim light reflecting off the wet pavement, I realized how delicate yet profound our connection had become. It was no longer about fleeting glances or accidental touches, it was about shared vulnerability, the kind that leaves an imprint long after the moment has passed. And I knew, with a strange certainty, that this slow, cautious bond, so fraught with unspoken emotion, was only beginning to deepen. It was during the school's annual literary evening that the subtle tension between us seemed to surface in ways I hadn't anticipated. The event was lively, a mix of quiet readings and soft chatter, the hum of conversation and the clinking of coffee cups creating a backdrop of ordinary life. Yet somehow, in the midst of the crowd, the space around her and me felt private, as if the world had quietly narrowed to just the two of us. We found ourselves near a display of student essays, leaning over the same table, the dim light casting soft shadows across her face. She glanced at me, her expression playful yet composed, as if daring me to break the careful rules we had both been following. "You really do overthink everything, don't you?" she teased, her voice low enough that only I could hear it. The corners of her eyes crinkled in that familiar, gentle way, and I felt my chest tighten, caught between admiration and an almost forbidden longing. As she spoke, her hand brushed lightly against my forearm, just enough to send a ripple of warmth up my arm. It was fleeting, casual on the surface, yet I could feel the intention beneath it, or perhaps the intention was mine, projected onto the moment. Either way, the sensation lingered, leaving me acutely aware of the proximity of her presence and the unspoken tension that hovered between us. We moved along the table together, our shoulders occasionally brushing, each contact charged with the quiet awareness of what could not be spoken aloud. She laughed at a student's awkward reading, and her smile seemed directed at me, though it was subtle enough that no one else would notice. The playful teasing in her tone, the gentle but deliberate closeness, made the air between us electric in a way that was thrilling yet entirely restrained. At one point, she paused, leaning slightly closer to read my notes, her hair brushing against my shoulder. The scent of her perfume, soft, warm, and faintly floral, mingled with the cool evening air, wrapping around me in a way that was both comforting and distracting. I tried to focus on the words on the page, but all I could think about was the warmth radiating from her, the quiet power of her presence, and the subtle brush of her fingers against mine as she adjusted a sheet. There was no overt confession, no declaration of desire. Everything was understated, deliberate in its restraint. Yet the tension was undeniable, a silent conversation carried through glances, gestures, and the smallest touches. It was forbidden play, not in any overt sense, but in the emotional danger of feeling something we both knew we couldn't fully act upon. By the end of the evening, as we said goodbye in the quiet of the school hallway, her hand lingered momentarily on my arm, a grounding yet intimate gesture that sent a quiet thrill through me. The world outside was dark and still, the rain from earlier having left the streets slick and reflective, but inside me, a storm of emotion had begun to swirl. The forbidden play of our connection had reached a new height, subtle yet undeniable, leaving me acutely aware that our slow-burn attraction was no longer just a fleeting curiosity, it was real, charged, and waiting for the next unspoken moment to deepen further. The weeks of subtle glances, fleeting touches, and quiet understanding had created a tension that neither of us could ignore. By now, it was impossible to pretend that the connection between us was anything less than significant. And yet, the social boundaries, the age gap, the professional expectations, all of it hovered over us like an unspoken warning. It happened during an unusually quiet afternoon in her office. Rain still tapped gently against the window panes, echoing the rhythm of my own heartbeat. She sat across from me behind her desk, papers neatly stacked to one side, her posture calm yet not entirely composed. I could see it in her eyes, the same conflicted mix of authority and vulnerability that had drawn me to her from the beginning. "I shouldn't feel this way," she admitted softly, her voice barely above a whisper, as though even saying it aloud risked exposure. Her fingers toyed with the edge of a paper, a subtle attempt at grounding herself. I should fail you for what you make me feel." The words landed between us like a delicate yet profound confession. There was no accusation in her tone, only honesty, raw and unshielded. My chest tightened, and I felt a rush of conflicting emotions, admiration, desire, and a deep, almost reverent respect. I wanted to tell her that I felt the same, that the moments between us had shifted something inside me, but words seemed inadequate, dangerous even. Instead, I leaned back slightly, letting my expression soften. "I understand," I said quietly, careful not to overstep. "And I feel it too. Every time you look at my work, or at me, it matters more than it should." My voice carried sincerity, not recklessness, and I saw her exhale, a mix of relief and tension, as if the acknowledgement itself eased a small weight. She hesitated, then reached out, her hand resting lightly on mine across the edge of the desk. The warmth of her touch was grounding, yet it carried an undeniable intensity. I could feel her heartbeat beneath the thin fabric of her sleeve, steady yet quickened by the unspoken charge between us. We didn't speak, because no words could fully capture the fragile mix of longing and restraint that hung in the air. For a long moment, time seemed to pause. The rain's soft rhythm outside became the only sound, underscoring the quiet intimacy of the office. It was a space where honesty and vulnerability met, a rare moment in which the professional and personal coexisted in a delicate balance. By the time I left her office, the emotional weight had shifted. There was no resolution, no crossing of boundaries, but a profound understanding had formed between us. We both recognized the pull of attraction, the intensity of mutual curiosity, and the necessity of restraint. The moment was charged yet respectful, intimate yet safe, a quiet reckoning of what we felt and what we could allow ourselves to express. Walking down the hallway, I realized that our connection had reached its emotional peak. The tension, once subtle, now hummed beneath the surface like a quiet current. And though we remained constrained by propriety, we were irrevocably changed by the honesty and recognition of desire, ready to navigate the final steps of our slow burn story with care, awareness, and undeniable affection. The final day of the seminar arrived with a quiet inevitability. The room smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood, sunlight streaming through the windows in soft, golden rays. It was a peaceful afternoon, yet there was a tension beneath the surface, a culmination of weeks of glances, touches, and unspoken understanding. I had spent the past few days rehearsing the words I would say when submitting my final project, but as I walked into the classroom, I realized that words alone could never capture what had grown between us. She was already there, moving gracefully among the scattered papers, her presence commanding the space even in its quietude. When our eyes met, there was no need for pretense. We both knew the weight of the past weeks, the stolen glances, the subtle touches, the emotional currents that had flowed just beneath the surface. And yet, there was a calm acceptance now, a mutual respect for what had blossomed in restraint. Handing her my final essay, I noticed how her fingers lingered on mine as she took it, a touch so brief and subtle that anyone else might have missed it. But to me, it carried all the warmth, reassurance, and quiet affection that had defined our interactions. She looked at me, eyes soft and attentive, and for a moment, it felt as though the world outside the classroom had vanished. The hum of the heater, the faint scratching of pencil on paper, even the distant sound of footsteps in the hall, all of it faded into the background, leaving only the connection between us. "I'm proud of your progress," she said, her voice low, calm, and intimate in its warmth. It was a compliment, yes, but also an acknowledgement of the journey we had shared, the conversations, the quiet moments of vulnerability, the subtle flirtations that had grown into something deeply meaningful. She offered a small, almost imperceptible smile, one that held both pride and a lingering fondness. As the final minutes of the seminar slipped by, we found ourselves lingering by the door, neither of us rushing to leave. Our hands brushed lightly once more, a fleeting, grounding gesture, and our eyes met, holding a depth of understanding that went beyond words. There was no need for dramatic declarations or overt gestures, everything had been said in those small touches, in the glances, in the shared moments that had defined the weeks. Finally, we stepped into the hallway together, the soft light of the late afternoon casting long shadows across the floor. She gave me a nod, gentle yet laden with meaning, and I felt a quiet joy at the balance we had achieved, affection without overstepping, intimacy without breaking boundaries, and a connection that was both profound and socially safe. Walking away, I realized that our story wasn't defined by physical closeness or overt romance. It was built on mutual respect, emotional honesty, and subtle affection, a slow-burn connection that left a lasting imprint. And though the seminar had ended, the warmth of our shared moments, the gentle touch of her hand, and the understanding reflected in her eyes would linger with me far beyond that classroom, a quiet testament to a bond that had grown carefully, deeply, and beautifully. If this slow-burn story of unspoken attraction and subtle affection moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell, so you never miss a story that makes your heart race and your mind linger in every stolen glance. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever felt a connection that words couldn't capture?